What kind of God would tell a grieving husband not to mourn the death of the person he loved most? Not just to remain faithful, not just to keep preaching, but to hide his grief, to shed no public tears, to perform no funeral rituals, to act as though nothing happened. At first glance, this may be one of the coldest commands in the entire Bible, and that's exactly why so many people struggle with it. Because if God is compassionate, why would he ask something that feels so heartless? But what if this story isn't about suppressing grief? What if it's actually revealing something devastating about an entire nation? And what if Ezekiel's personal tragedy became one of the most powerful warnings ever recorded in Scripture? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this command was given, what it meant to the people who witnessed it, and why its message still speaks to people facing loss, disappointment, and unanswered questions today. When people think of Ezekiel, they usually remember the visions, the wheels within wheels, the strange prophetic signs, the dramatic warnings of coming judgment. But long before he became known as one of the Bible's most extraordinary prophets, Ezekiel was something much simpler. He was a husband, and hidden within the pages of his book is a detail so personal that many readers pass right over it. God refers to Ezekiel's wife with a phrase that appears only once in this story: the delight of your eyes. Think about that for a moment. Not merely your wife, not simply your companion, the delight of your eyes. The person whose presence brightened ordinary days. The face you looked for when you entered a room. The person who made an uncertain future feel a little less frightening. It's one of the most tender descriptions of a marriage found anywhere in the prophetic books. And that's what makes what happens next so difficult to process. Because prophets often seem larger than life. They confront kings, challenge nations, deliver messages from heaven. But this small phrase reminds us that Ezekiel was not merely a prophet carrying God's message. He was a man with a heart, a man who loved, a man who dreamed, a man who had something precious to lose. Perhaps while Jerusalem's future hung in the balance, his wife remained one of the few sources of comfort in an increasingly dark world. A familiar voice, a trusted companion, a reminder that even in turbulent times, some things still felt secure. Then, without warning, God speaks. And the message is unlike any Ezekiel has ever received. It isn't about nations. It isn't about armies. It isn't about judgment. This time, the message is painfully personal. God tells him that the person he treasures most will be taken away, and by the next day, she will be gone. In that moment, the story stops being a prophecy about a nation. It becomes the story of a broken heart. If the story ended with God warning Ezekiel about his wife's death, it would already be heartbreaking. But that's not where the story ends. In fact, this is where it becomes one of the most disturbing passages in the entire Bible. Because after revealing what is about to happen, God gives Ezekiel a command that seems almost impossible. You shall not mourn. No public weeping, no traditional lament, no gathering of mourners, no funeral customs, no outward display of grief. The very things that people naturally do when their hearts are shattered. Ezekiel is told not to do them. Try to imagine hearing those words, not from a stranger, not from an enemy, but from God. And then comes the sentence that hits with devastating simplicity. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. No dramatic description, no lengthy explanation, just a single sentence, as if the weight of the moment is too heavy for words. The woman God called the delight of your eyes is suddenly gone. And the next morning, Ezekiel does exactly what he was told. He gets up. He goes out among the people. And he does not mourn publicly. No visible breakdown, no public tears, no funeral rituals. Nothing. Can you imagine how unsettling that must have been for those watching? The people knew loss. They understood grief. They knew what mourning was supposed to look like. Yet, here stood a husband who had just lost the person closest to him, behaving in a way that defied every expectation. The silence itself became impossible to ignore. Whispers likely spread through the crowd. Why isn't he mourning? Has grief broken him? Is he in shock? What is he trying to tell us? And that was exactly the point, because Ezekiel's silence was speaking louder than words ever could. God was about to use one man's unimaginable loss to deliver a message that an entire nation could no longer afford to ignore. But before we can understand why, we need to understand what was happening beyond Ezekiel's home. Because while one family was experiencing heartbreak, an entire nation was standing on the edge of catastrophe, and most of them didn't even realize it. To understand why God gave such a shocking command, we have to leave Ezekiel's home for a moment and step into the world he was living in. Because this story was never only about one man's loss, it was about an entire nation's blindness. At the time, Judah was living through one of the most dangerous periods in its history. The kingdom was unraveling, political alliances were failing, corruption had spread through every level of society, and the spiritual condition of the nation was even worse. For generations, prophets had been warning the people, turn back, change course, disaster is coming. But warning after warning was ignored. Life continued as normal. People built plans, conducted business, raised families, and convinced themselves that everything would somehow work out. Meanwhile, a powerful empire was rising in the east, Babylon. With every passing year, its influence expanded. Cities fell, kingdoms disappeared. Nation after nation learned that Babylon's armies were not a threat to be taken lightly. Yet many in Judah still believed they were untouchable, not because they were stronger, but because they had Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was different. At the center of the city stood the temple, the most sacred place in the nation. For many people, it represented far more than a building. It was their identity, their history, their security, their connection to God. As long as the temple stood, many assumed they were safe. Surely God would never allow it to fall. Surely Jerusalem could never become another conquered city. Surely the warnings were exaggerated. But that confidence was built on a dangerous illusion. Because while the people trusted in the presence of the temple, many had drifted far from the God the temple was meant to honor. They had become attached to the symbol while ignoring the reality. And now, a moment of reckoning was approaching. What the people could not see was that Babylon's armies were already moving history toward an unavoidable collision. The city they trusted, the place they loved, the future they assumed was guaranteed. All of it was hanging by a thread, and God knew something they refused to believe. Jerusalem was about to fall. The temple was about to be destroyed. Everything they considered permanent was about to vanish. Which brings us back to Ezekiel. Because God wasn't asking him to endure personal tragedy for no reason. His loss was becoming a sign, a living preview of what the nation itself was about to experience. Just as Ezekiel would lose the delight of his eyes, Judah was about to lose the delight of theirs. And when that happened, the people would finally understand what God had been trying to tell them all along. God explains that Ezekiel's loss symbolized something much larger. His wife represented what was precious, cherished, deeply loved. For the people, that cherished thing was Jerusalem and the temple. Just as Ezekiel suddenly lost the delight of his eyes, the nation would lose the center of its world. But here's the disturbing part. The coming destruction would be so overwhelming that normal mourning would become impossible. Shock would replace ritual. Disbelief would replace tears. The people would be emotionally paralyzed. Ezekiel's silence wasn't teaching people not to grieve. It was illustrating the magnitude of what was coming. His personal pain became a visual prophecy, a warning no sermon alone could communicate. For perhaps the first time, people saw God's message embodied in human suffering. But this still leaves us with a difficult question. Why use Ezekiel's pain at all? Why involve an innocent person? The answer reveals something profound about biblical prophecy. Throughout Scripture, God's messengers often carry part of the burden of the message they deliver. They don't simply announce suffering. They experience it. Ezekiel wasn't standing outside the nation's story. He was carrying a piece of it. His heartbreak mirrored God's own heartbreak over a people moving toward destruction. Because beneath the judgment was grief, the grief of rejected warnings, broken covenant, lost relationship. This story isn't about a detached God demanding sacrifice. It's about a God whose messenger felt the cost of the message. Many people know what it feels like when life changes overnight. A phone call, a diagnosis, a loss, a disappointment, a door suddenly closes. And in those moments, one question often rises. Why? Why did this happen? Why didn't God stop it? Why does pain sometimes arrive without explanation? Ezekiel's story doesn't give easy answers, but it does reveal something important. Not every painful season immediately makes sense. Sometimes meaning is only visible when viewed from a larger perspective. Sometimes what feels like silence is part of a story we cannot yet see. And sometimes faith means continuing forward before understanding arrives. The most heartbreaking part of Ezekiel's story is not that he lost someone he loved. It's that he carried a message people refused to hear until it was too late. Yet even after judgment came, God's story was not finished. Because Ezekiel's book eventually shifts from destruction to restoration, from loss to renewal, from exile to hope. The same prophet who witnessed devastation later received visions of rebuilding, healing, and future life. And maybe that's the final lesson. Pain is not always the end of the story. Sometimes the chapters that break us become the chapters that prepare us for restoration. Ezekiel lost the delight of his eyes. But through his suffering, generations would learn a truth that still matters today. Even when God's purposes are difficult to understand, hope can survive where certainty cannot. And perhaps the real mystery isn't why Ezekiel was forbidden to mourn, but why, after everything he endured, he never stopped believing that restoration was still possible. If that speaks to you, write it in the comments as a declaration today. Even when I don't understand God's plan, I choose to trust His heart. And if you're walking through a difficult season right now, remember this. What feels like the end may simply be a page in a much bigger story. The same God who brought restoration after Ezekiel's heartbreak is still able to bring purpose, healing, and hope from the chapters we never would have chosen ourselves. Thank you for watching. And if this story changed the way you see Scripture, be sure to subscribe and join us for more hidden biblical discoveries. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which biblical figure should we uncover next? Because sometimes the people we overlook contain the lessons we need most.